Hello and welcome back to Sociology 101. Today we're going to be answering the question, is Calvinism equal to fatalism? Quick answer right up front, not necessarily, no. Does Calvinism lead to fatalism? Only if God determines it to. That's the answer, which is a part of why Calvinism can become so fatalistic. Because even if fatalism is something that Calvinists want to distance themselves from, they have to confess that the only reason anybody would become Calvinistic or fatalistic, either one, is because ultimately God theistically determines them to become that way. And that's part of the problem. Now, I want you to hear from Calvinists themselves. As many times here on the program, I play Calvinists for themselves so that you can hear what they say, not just what I say. How many leading Calvinists out there do that for us? I get accused of misrepresenting Calvinists and all these kinds of things on Twitter and everything. How many of them are even coming close to trying to represent our perspective in the way that I have tried to represent theirs? How many of them play us in our own words? How many of us have them on our program like I do, have me on their program or vice versa? There's standing invitations for many of the leading Calvinists out there. Any of the leading Calvinists that are out there, like a MacArthur, Piper, Sproul, Tim Keller, Matt Chandler, any of these guys are welcome to come on the program anytime. Just reach out to me. I'd be glad to have you on the program, defend your position, give you as much time as you need to do so. I'm not afraid to allow for Calvinists to have the time to defend their perspective. That's why I often have good Calvinist brothers on the program. And I like to play Calvinists for themselves. In other words, I want to try to represent Calvinists in their own words. I want them to represent themselves. And so, as you know, many of you are aware that I have interacted with the Consistent Calvinist. I've learned his name is Colin since then, so we can refer to him as Colin now. I believe that's correct. And so I have a clip from him. This is weeks ago that he did this broadcast. It wasn't. I try not to do the response to the responses to the responses, just because that can get really lengthy and cumbersome. But I did want to deal with this one because he answers the question, are Calvinists fatalist? And of course, he's going to say, no, Calvinists aren't fatalist. But he does do a good job, I think, of defining the problem. In other words, he hits the proper definitions of the terms and gives us, I can think, a good analogy for us to be able to kind of play with and look at from both perspectives. And then we'll also look at an article I wrote years ago on this very question. Does ultimately Calvinism lead to theistic fatalism? Is it the same as theistic fatalism? What is the difference, if there is a difference? Because I do believe there is a difference between being a Calvinist, a consistent Calvinist, and being a fatalist. I do believe there's a difference between that. And you'll understand, I think, better as we go through this program as to what that difference is and what it entails and why it's significant. And if it's a difference with a distinction that's worth noting. And so let's keep that in mind as well. So here is Colin, the Consistent Calvinist Podcast, answering the question, are Calvinists fatalists?
So back to the question at hand, are Calvinists fatalists? My answer to that question is no, because fatalism is more than just a recognition that things are determined. As you're going to see when we read these definitions, fatalism includes a mindset and an application of what I believe to be an illogical false assumption based upon things being determined, but nonetheless, it is a mindset and an application of an attitude of resignation towards events, right? It's just this, well, since it's going to happen, why bother to do anything type of attitude, right? That is inherent in fatalism.
Okay, so notice he's correct. The difference between a theistic determinist, i.e. Calvinist, and if you don't think Calvinists are theistic determinists, then you're wrong. Sorry, Calvin was a theistic determinist. All leading Calvinistic scholars who know what they're talking about are theistic determinists. If you claim to be a Calvinist but are not a theistic determinist, then come up with another name. Sorry, you're not a Calvinist by any definition of the term, at least from their own sources. So you can call yourself something else if you'd like, some modified form of quasi-Fullerism or something. I don't know. But when I say Fullerism, I'm talking about Richard Fuller, because he might be one of the proponents of that kind of perspectives, or a Spurgeonite or something. I don't know. Just don't call yourself a Calvinist, because I think you're confusing people when you do that, because John Calvin was, by his own estimation, a theistic determinist. That's what he believed and taught. John Piper is a theistic determinist. The leading scholars like Helm and others that promote Calvinism are promoting theistic determinism. So this guy here, I think Colin is happily confesses he is a theistic determinist. Okay, so I'm not going to debate with the modified quasi non-Calvinist Calvinist out there, but I'm going to deal with a consistent Calvinist here in this particular podcast. So when he's talking about fatalism, notice what he's saying. It's more than just believing in determinism. So he confesses, yes, fatalism is a belief in determinism. It's a mindset or an application of your belief in determinism that's different. So it's not a difference of belief. Fatalists believe the exact same thing that the determinist does. All things, both the ends and the means, are determined by God. They both believe the exact same thing. The difference is how they apply that belief. In other words, the mindset that develops because of that belief in determinism. But here's the problem with that, Colin. Who determines your application of your belief in determinism? If not God. This is the problem. Is if anybody becomes a theistic fatalist instead of a good theistic determinist like yourself, it's only because God determined for them to become a theistic fatalist. In other words, the very application that you say distinguishes between you and the fatalist is in itself determined by God, which again makes this absolutely irrational and the whole concept of determinism completely untenable, unworkable, unlivable. And that's what we're continually arguing. But Colin is right. The only difference really is not the belief, it's the behavior. Both the fatalist and determinist believe the exact same thing. Both Calvinist and fatalist believe the exact same thing. Everything is determined ultimately by something outside themselves, and they have no control over that. The difference is the fatalist applies that in such a way as to say, my behavior doesn't matter, therefore. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what I do. It doesn't matter if we're involved or not, okay? But the only reason they think that way or they do that is because God determines them to. And that's the problem within their system. So let's go on and listen to what he goes on to say.
Okay. So when you're accusing somebody of being a fatalist, you're basically accusing them of having that mindset. Okay. Now, just because you're not a Calvinist and you disagree with things being determined, just because your false assumption is, well, if everything was determined, therefore fatalism would follow, that doesn't mean you get to accuse people who believe that all things are determined of having that same mindset.
Now, he's correct there. So you can't assume that just because somebody affirms the claims of the Calvinistic soteriology and theistic determinism, that they therefore act like a fatalist. C'est la vie, c'est vie, whatever that statement is, what will be, it doesn't matter. I'm going to be anti-evangelistic. I'm not going to care. I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to, what will be. You can't accuse every Calvinist of being that way because not every Calvinist does act that way. It's demonstrably false to say that everybody who affirms the Calvinistic deterministic beliefs are therefore applying that in a fatalistic way. They're not, but some do. And the reason that they do is God on Calvinism. And so the only reason that a person who believes in theistic determinism doesn't become a fatalist is because God determines them not to become a fatalist. And the only reason that a theistic determinist might become a fatalist is because God determines them to become a fatalist. And that doesn't seem to be even on the radar of Colin, at least in this video from what I heard.
Right. And so I'm not going to deny that you can't, search high and low and find a particular definition that somebody somewhere is calling fatalism and make it sort of line up with Calvinism. If that's really the road you want to go down, fine. I just think it's pretty obvious that you're not trying to put forth an honest representation of a particular view. You got to realize when you throw these accusations around, the people who hear you saying you Calvinists are fatalists, if they don't know exactly what that word means, they're going to go Google it, and they're going to be reading the definitions that I'm reading in this episode, right? They're going to read these definitions, and as you'll see, this stuff ain't Calvinism, guys, right? The only thing that you're going to see in these definitions that Calvinism might have in common is things being determined. But as you'll see.
So notice he rightly, that's why I appreciate the consistent Calvinist here. He rightly affirms that Calvinist and fatalist believe the same thing, i.e. omnideterminism, EDD, exhaustive divine determinism. They believe the exact same thing. Everything, every molecule, every thought, every action, every deed, everything is meticulously brought to pass by the sovereign decree of God. They both believe that. The difference is the determinist doesn't live like that's true, and the fatalist does. Okay? The fatalist applies his determinism in such a way as not to be involved, as not to behave, as not to get involved with things because, after all, it's all determined. And the only reason he would ever do that is because God ultimately determined for him to do that, for the praise of his glory, no less. Go figure. This is why it's unattainable. This is why William Lane Craig calls it dizzying. A sense of vertigo sets in when you begin to really look at the claims of this system.
See this play out. Everybody's worldview has aspects of things being determined. A lot of these definitions of fatalism can be flipped around on the other side, and it just comes down to what are you really being honest when you go down this road? And I just have to ask the free will side. You've got the idea of determinism, which is so clearly a more accurate representation of what Calvinism puts forth, what I have consistently put forth in these episodes, right? Full-blown determinism. And then you have fatalism. And you just have to ask yourself, if you could call me one or the other, why would you seek to call me a fatalist instead of a determinist? Something I've openly affirmed. And there's only one thing I can assume out of that, and that's, unfortunately, a little bit of dishonesty on your part, right? It's because you want to spark a negative aspect in people's minds, this fatalistic mindset that we're going to show that these definitions have. You want that to spark in people's minds so that they'll shy away from my particular view, right?
Okay, and I think he has a point here. I think it's wrong to just assume that because somebody believes in theistic determinism, that therefore they apply it in a fatalistic manner. And Colin may not be one of those people that ever does that. Now, the question is, does he ever do it or not? I don't know Colin. I don't know how he lives his life. But I remember as a Calvinist, there were times in which I did act fatalistically because of my belief in determinism. Okay. I was still evangelistic. I still participated and did the things that I thought I was supposed to do, that God called me to do. But there were times that my belief in determinism caused me not to act in the way that I should have been acting. Does that make sense? And I've given my testimony before about falling into some addictions and those kinds of things, and then ultimately being counseled by a Calvinist, ultimately saying that, well, God gives you a thorn in the flesh to keep you humble, that ultimately the reason that you're struggling with this addiction is because God determines all things that come to pass. That includes the desires you have for this addictive behavior. Your addiction itself is thus determined by God. And that led me to not take the appropriate steps to rid myself of the addiction, but instead just to say, hey, God, stop decreeing this, stop determining me to do these things. Okay. Instead of taking ownership for my own free will actions, I was instead saying, God, stop determining my free will actions, because after all, determinism is true. So what was I doing? I was acting, whether I recognized it or not, in a fatalistic way because of my belief in theistic determinism. Now, Colin may have very well say that that's the wrong thing to do. You shouldn't have done that, Leighton. But that doesn't change the fact that I did do that in my own ignorance, not recognizing that, one, theistic determinism is wrong, and therefore my choices were my own, not God's determinations, and therefore take ownership of my own sin and seek the healing and the provision of God to rid myself and to distance myself from the sin that was enslaving me. And so what the theistic determinist doesn't seem to recognize is that when people make even individual decisions that are based more fatalistically, i.e., well, if it'll be, it'll be. If God wants that person to be saved, I know I should be going to witness to him right now, but I have other things to do. If he decides in his, well, you know what, if God's going to save him, he's going to save him, regardless of whether I take the time to do that today. Even if he makes one fatalistic kind of application of his deterministic system, then that in itself was not only something determined by God, if determinism is true, or it was a fatalistic application that caused you to do something against the will of God, that led you to false behaviors because you held to a false belief. And that's what we believe obviously is happening. Anytime a good theistic determinist like Colin makes a decision based upon his fatalistic mindset, whether rightly or wrongly, he's doing so because God determined him to on his system. He's doing so wrongly and freely on our system, and therefore he needs to be called out in his mistake and his error when he does that, just like I need to be called out for my mistake and my error when I was applying these things wrongly. All right, I'm gonna give him full hearing here, at least this first. I'm just playing from like the 2-minute mark to the 11-minute mark or so. I'm not going to play the whole thing. I've put the link in the show notes for you to go listen to his whole broadcast. I'm encouraging you to do that. Don't hear me saying that you shouldn't listen to the whole thing. You should go listen to it. I have nothing to hide from what he says. I'm just engaging with the first portion of it in order to combat what I think is the Calvinistic position here.
And I just think that's sad. Maybe I'm not trying to be presumptive on people's parts, but those of you who do level this accusation of fatalism, please rethink it, right? Listen through in this episode, listen to the definitions, and just rethink going down that road in the future. That's all I ask, all right? So what I'd like to do before we start reading definitions is just go over the basic difference between a fatalistic idea versus a deterministic idea. And so you can sort of see how the only real thing that these two views or definitions or words, I should say, have in common is the fact that particular things are going to happen. They're determined to happen, and yet the attitude that it conveys in people's minds as to how they view those events or what comes before those events or the part that they play in those events are drastically different, as you're going to see. So the most obvious problem with this idea of fatalism, first of all, when Calvinists are accused of being fatalists, the most common thing a Calvinist should be saying is, first of all, define the term. But what most people mean is that, well, X, Y, or Z is going to happen, and therefore your effort doesn't matter, right? Why try? Why combat evil? Why preach the gospel? All these false assumptions that come against Calvinism on a constant basis. This demonstrates this fatalistic idea of hopelessness or pointlessness to human effort. And what's funny about this is based upon the non-Calvinist false assumption that they are basically assuming from the start a fatalistic viewpoint.
Okay, and the reason the non-Calvinist is doing that is because God determined them to. Keep that in mind. I'm not trying to be facetious. I'm not trying to be funny. I'm not trying to be mean. It's just the fact of the matter on your system. The reason that the non-Calvinist comes to that illogical, incorrect conclusion about theistic determinism is because God determined him to, on your view. Just keep that in mind and see how tenable it really is for you to correct people in their false assumptions that you believe God determined unchangeably for them to have about your system.
And then trying to accuse Calvinists of that very attitude, that fatalistic attitude. And this is where the problem comes in. So very, very simply, fatalism is just going to basically say that particular events are predetermined or inevitable or fated to happen. And they're going to happen regardless of what you do, or they're going to happen regardless of what anybody does, or they're going to happen regardless of what comes before them.
Okay, now is that true or false? Is Joe Christian, just a random Christian out there who's going to become a Christian one day, is he going to become a Christian regardless of whether you call and witness to him or not? Yes or no? If he's elect, will he become a Christian regardless of whether you witness it to him or not? Now you may say, no, well, if God determined for me to be the one who witnesses to him to lead him to faith, then no. But that's the very point that's up for debate, is that if God determined you to do that, you don't know if he's determined you to do that. And therefore, when you're making the decision as to whether you go witness to Joe or not, you are ultimately could be making a decision based upon either fatalistic logic, i.e., he's going to be saved regardless if I'm involved or not, which hopefully you wouldn't do. You as a good Christian would go, no, if I'm feeling the prompting of the Spirit to go and to witness to Joe, I'm going to go witness to Joe. And therefore, the only reason you go witness to Joe is because God determined for you to go witness to Joe, right? So it's not based upon a decision that you deliberate and make. It's based upon what God has decreed, determined for you to do. And therefore, when you decide not to go witness to Joe, at those points when you decide not to go witness, when you're prompted to go do so, you can always go back and go, well, I guess God didn't determine me to go witness to Joe. You can always fall back on fatalistic applications, logic. It's like, well, the reason I must not have gone to witness to Joe is not because of my own responsibility, but because God didn't decree me to.
The major difference between that and a determinist viewpoint is that a determinist like myself would say that everything happens for a reason. And so, yes, particular things, or I would say all things, as we'll get to, but particular things are predetermined or determined to happen. They're going to come to pass, but they're going to come to pass precisely because of what comes before them, not in spite of, or regardless of what comes before them. They're going to come to pass precisely because of what comes before them. Okay? And so what you'll notice as we go through these definitions of fatalism, they are usually focused on bad things rather than good things, right? It's a very dismal worldview. They usually all have an attitude of submission attached to them, like, what's the point? Or my efforts don't matter. And there's also, there's no real rhyme or reason to what those events are or why they're happening. Reasons aren't mentioned. There's no mention of causality at all. As you're going to see, determinism is based 100% on causality and a connection between events, so that events are leading to events are leading to events. There's a connection there, right? But with all these definitions that we go through of fatalism doesn't really convey the idea of causality at all, right? Or causative connections between what you're looking at and what comes before or after them. Also, the idea of quote-unquote events is undefined in all of these things. And so you really sort of have to ask, especially in the definitions that don't say all events, which events are you talking about? And this brings me to another important point of the difference between fatalism and determinism, is that fatalism often starts with you. It starts with the person, and we look out at events, right, that are outside of us, and we're looking at those as the events. And therefore, we then look back at our actions and think that they're pointless or whatnot. But a deterministic worldview is more looking at reality from the top down. And it's focusing on the fact that you are included in that web of causes and effects, right? You don't transcend it. You're not separate from it. You are part of the picture. So it looks at it more from the top down and tries to see the big picture and realize that you play a part in it, right?
Okay, so what he's getting to here is God ordains the ends as well as the means, is basically, in a nutshell, what he's trying to get to. Whereas on fatalism, it's not so much emphasize the means by which all things are determined, but of course a fatalist would also believe all the means are determined just as much as all the ends are. But the determinist is focusing upon the fact that they may be one of those means, therefore they should behave, they should do what we're called to do. And I want to interact with some of the side chat. Jason Jenkins, Leighton, God doesn't determine what people think. What are you talking about? I agree. I don't know if you follow the broadcast, Jason, but I'm not a determinist. Okay, I don't believe God determines all things, like the thoughts of people. On Calvinism, however, God has determined whatsoever comes to pass, which would include the thoughts of all people. Now, if you're trying to argue that Calvinists don't believe that God determines what people think, then I just have to point you to the sources, because that's exactly what they teach, based upon the leading sources. Now, you may know of Calvinists who are not determinists, or who hold to some modified form of Calvinism that doesn't include theistic determinism. That's fine. That's just not true Calvinism as John Calvin taught it, as John Piper teaches it today, as the leading confessions teach it to be. So I just have to point you to the sources with regard to what people believe. Zach Avery is saying there's a reason leading Calvinists won't engage with you or take your position seriously. Videos like these are that reason. I'm not sure what you're referring to, Zach. I'm playing a Calvinist for himself. I think Colin represents what many Calvinist scholars believe and teach. And I'm not sure if you are accusing me of not being fair to Calvinists or leading Calvinists. I'm not sure what you're insinuating with regard to that. But if you have a particular thing that I said, or a way in which I said it to back up your accusation, I'd be glad to entertain that. So Brian, I put up this a second ago. Brian mentions here that he was a Calvinist for 8 years. I'm trying to scroll back through and find it. I think it's scrolled back up. You guys have so much going on the side chat here. Sometimes the side chats go, oh, there it is. Okay. Brian mentions I've been a Calvinist for about 9 years. And for 8 of them, you've had me question the doctrine now. And then he asks this question. This is what I wanted to get to. He says, but one thing I don't understand is why does it have to be full on determinism on God's part? Can he not determine some things without determining others? Exactly. That's exactly what we believe. He does determine some things. He determined, for example, the writing of Scripture. This is therefore of God. Therefore, when you have a Bible, you can say this is the word of God because this was inspired by God. He sovereignly and unchangeably brought about the writing of Scripture. And that would be an example of him determining something. He determined for Jesus to come and to die on Calvary for the provision of atonement for the world. We believe he determined that to happen. Now, we don't believe he did so by determining sin and evil, but he, instead, knowing sinful men, knowing evil people in their context, he used them in their evil, blinding them from the truth so as to accomplish his purpose through them. And the example we've used before is like a speed trap. For example, the law is posted 55 miles an hour. This is the posted law. You're not to exceed that. So a police officer might hide his presence, which doesn't cause speeders to speed, but it keeps them doing what they already want to do. In the same way, God might hide his presence in the first century, his identity as Christ through using parabolic language and using riddles, hiding his identity, only revealing or entrusting himself to a few, a remnant from Israel, in order to hide these things from the leading Israelite people of the day so that they would crucify the Messiah. And so he's not causing their evil intentions or their evil heart or their rebellion against God. He's merely hiding the identity of Christ so that they would continue to do what they already want to do, much like the speeders already want to speed. And by hiding his identity, his presence, the speeders continue to speed. That's what hardening is. That's what blinding people in their rebellion is all about. And so he's not determining the evil intentions of men in order to bring about the crucifixion. He's determining, however, the crucifixion for the remission of sin. So he's not causing the very sin that he's dying to redeem, as the Calvinistic system would entail. And that's what we point out. God does determine some things, and he always will bring about what he determines. Free will is not a superpower that can thwart the determinations and the will of God, okay? And so we have to continually point these things out, because sometimes Calvinists think, oh, look, if we can prove God determined one thing, then theistic determinism has been established. And that's just false, because you have to prove not only that he determines one thing, you have to prove that he determines everything, and that he can't possibly pull it off determining one particular event without being implicated as the associate in the fault of people's wills and actions, sinful as they may be. And that's what we're contending with here on this program. And so I wanted to interact with some of those things. Okay, Zach replies here. Please deal with the actual definitions Calvinists use in describing the nature of compatibilism. I have. I've used monergism.com, put it up on the website several different times, have it on quotes. I've had quotes from Phil Johnson. I've had quotes from leading scholars like John Piper, leading scholars like Helm, and others who have defined what compatibilism is. I've put them on the screen dozens of times, Zach, and have dealt with their claims of compatibilism. I've used Hamilton's article, who is a leading philosopher from our perspective who contends with the leading compatibilistic scholars. I've recommended the 4 Views of the book with regard to these different issues. And I have dealt with the scriptures that are used to oftentimes promote those different doctrines. So if maybe you're not familiar with these broadcasts, or maybe you're not watching, maybe you've heard secondhand from men like James White or some others out there about what you think I do on this program. But I would just encourage you, Zach, do your homework before bringing public accusations against people. Go and listen to the programs where I actually do bring citations and arguments from the leading compatibilistic sources. Just type in Sociology 101 and compatibilism, and you'll have 4 or 5 videos right at the top that you can go through and you can actually listen to and see where I've cited from the leading compatibilistic sources, and then I've contended with their views. Now, you may not agree with me, that's fine, but to accuse me of not dealing with the leading scholars from your perspective is just demonstrably false, brother. So I know you're angry with me. I know you don't like me. That's okay. I still love you. It's all right. Calm down and look at the sources. Go back and read the actual source where I'm quoting from, and see if I'm not being fair with my compatibilistic friends. And then compare that to the way other leading Calvinists have dealt with our perspectives. like the videos I've played from John MacArthur saying that Arminians are full-on Pelagians and absolutely don't believe that God initiates salvation, but that we have to initiate salvation, things like that. Or Matt Chandler saying that, Arminians believe that God gets into a DeLorean and travels into the future to foresee who's going to believe in him, and those are the ones he selects for salvation. And compare and contrast the leading Calvinistic voices and how they represent Arminians and non-Calvinists compared to what I've been doing weekly on this program. Demonstrably, I think you'll see that I am more fair and I am more reasonable and I am more willing to engage with actual Calvinist scholars than what the leading Calvinists are doing to and with those who disagree with them. Now, that's not across the board. I say leading Calvinist voices because I'm talking about the big name dogs that everybody knows, like MacArthur and Sproul and all these kind of guys. Those guys are typically the ones that aren't representing the alternative, the Arminian alternatives, in a very fair and reasonable manner, in my experience, in my estimation. Now, there are some others like Chris Date and Sean Cole and some others that are not real big names who do go a lot further in their efforts to try to properly represent us. And I do appreciate those people for doing that. It's just not the leading Calvinistic voices out there. It hasn't made its way up to the leading voices for them to actually start doing these kinds of things. And that's the problem. Hopefully you understand where I'm coming from there. Now, I want you to continue to listen to Colin here, because he gets an analogy that we'll kind of play off of to help us to see the two perspectives, which I think will give us some clarity.
So these definitions of fatalism, as you're going to see, almost every single one of them drives a wedge between these quote-unquote events and human actions or choices or effort. Okay? This is going to be a very common theme throughout these definitions. And before one more quick thing before we sort of jump into definitions, I just want to give an example that I always thought served a purpose. It's just a little analogy, and that is that a determinist and a fatalist are on a boat and a passenger falls over. The fatalist immediately says, "Don't worry, if he's fated to live, he'll live. We don't need to do anything." The determinist immediately says, "But what if it's fated or determined that we throw him a rope?" Right? So you see very clearly in that cheesy example two important differences in the worldviews of those particular people. You got the fatalist and the determinist. The fatalist assumes that his effort is completely irrelevant to the outcome of a particular event, whereas the determinist assumes that his effort is completely part of the picture of a particular outcome. Right? His effort can have a determinative connection to, in this case, whether or not somebody lives. So
perfect example. Okay, two guys are in a boat. One's a determinist, like Colin, and one is a fatalist. Okay, so the fatalist and the determinist are in the boat. There's a guy drowning. The fatalist says, doesn't matter what we do. If he's going to drown, he's going to drown. And it's all fated. So I'm just going to sit here. I'm going to be passive. Because I believe in determinism, I'm going to act passively. The determinist goes, no, wait. God may have determined us to be the ones who throw him a rope so as to be the means by which he's saved. So let's throw him a rope. And the fatalist goes, I don't think it matters. If God wants him to live, whether we're involved or not, he's going to live. Maybe he'll get a second wind here and start swimming better. He's going to live regardless of whether we're involved or not. We can't determine the life of this man and how long he's going to live. So I'm not going to do anything. And you go, no, we should do something because I might be the means by which this guy's alive. And so I want to be a part of it. And the fatalist goes, no, I'm not going to let you. And I'm taking the analogy further. Let's say now the fatalist holds you and keeps you from doing it, keeps you from throwing the rope, and this man drowns. Or he convinces you through argumentation. It doesn't matter if you're involved. So he convinces you to act fatalistically in this particular instance, whatever the case may be. Here's the question. Why did that happen? Why did he act fatalistically? Why did he act by not behaving rightly and throwing the rope when he should have? Because God determined him to think that way. He determined him to convince or to restrain you in some way, to keep you from throwing the rope at the point of need. God, if fatalism is true, or if determinism is true for that matter, the reason determinism caused one person to act fatalistically is because God determined for him to act fatalistically. That is the problem. And so This is why we argue that this is a distinction without a difference, because you are arguing against fatalists being fatalist as if fatalists have any control over them becoming fatalist, as if they have any control over whether they are convinced by your arguments or not. This is the vertigo that William Lane Craig talks about setting in, to be able to adhere to and agree with any particular doctrinal system assumes a sense of libertarian free will. And this is what your system denies, making this, again, completely untenable. This is one of the reasons I added this article to Sociology 101 is because I'm dealing with this very issue. And so I want to take you through this. Is Calvinism theistic fatalism? And so let's walk through this just briefly. When I was a 5-point Calvinist, I was also evangelistic. I participated in mission efforts and was as active in sharing my faith with others as I am today. In this blog and on my podcast, I've regularly strived to help my non-Calvinist brethren understand that Calvinists are not typically anti-evangelistic, at least the ones I'm aware of, and that every modern day Calvinistic scholar or pastor that I know is very interested in spreading the gospel to all people, as logically inconsistent as that may appear to some. It's a verifiable fact of the matter. So let's just stop for a second right here, and let's just remember all the voices and accusations that you'll hear from some of the people who never take time to listen to me, who never take the time to actually hear me out. Leighton's being completely unreasonable. Some people will just see the thumbnail about fatalism and just assume, oh, there goes Leighton accusing all Calvinists of being fatalist and anti-evangelistic, without actually listening to what I wrote this 4 or 5 years ago, guys. I've said this dozens of times before. I've actually called out people for calling Calvinist anti-evangelists because it's just demonstrably untrue. I don't know how to be any more objective, brothers. I don't know how to be any more reasonable. And I still, despite how much I try to bring this kind of clarity and objectivity to these discussions, I still get countless accusations from Calvinists of doing things I've not done before, or saying things I don't believe. Maybe because they've read a quote from somebody on my comment page or something like that, who's not representing my particular perspective. I don't know. But some people just automatically assume they know what somebody believes or thinks without actually listening to what that person actually says. And I think Zach, for example, in SideChat, he's a perfect example of this. He's not listening to me. He's not, based on what I'm seeing anyway, he's not interested at all in hearing my perspective or being objective in this discussion. Why? He's already got a picture of, I know what Leighton is, I know who he is, I know what he believes, and I'm just going to full bore come out against him without really taking in and listening to what he has to say and understanding him before I fire off a response. This is called Christian maturity, brothers. When you can get to a level of Christian maturity, you're able to actually hear and listen to somebody from their perspective and understand where they're coming from, and understand they're not the boogeyman that they've been painted in your mind by the anti-provisionist out there. You need to listen to the original sources, and that goes both ways. You guys need to go listen to some of what Tim Keller or Sproul or other Calvinists teach, because many of them are much more reasonable than you paint them out to be. Though you can disagree with them, there's no reason to straw man them in order to contend with what they say. The things that they actually say are contemptible enough without trying to make it a lot more contemptible than it actually is. So in other words, deal with what they actually say, not with what sometimes people accuse them of saying. Go to the sources, read the sources, and understand what they're saying, and then bring an accusation or an argument, okay, based upon what they actually believe. All right, with that said, let's continue with the article. This fact, however, does not negate the merit of some sound logical arguments raised against the Calvinistic belief system. There is good reason that when believers are introduced to Calvinism, their first question is typically about the necessity of evangelism. Isn't that true? How many times have you heard Calvinism brought up? And for the very first time, when somebody's first introduced to Calvinism, what is the number one objection you'll hear? Well, why are we involved in evangelism then? Why even evangelize? What's the point of evangelism? That's almost universally the response of hearing about Calvinism, almost universally. This is a natural reaction to the teaching of Calvinism, and it's evidenced by the volumes of work which have been produced by Calvinists themselves, the scholars themselves over the years have written tons of material trying to defend why evangelism is still necessary, even though the claims of Calvinism are true. Again, that's just demonstrably the facts of the matter. Calvinists have spilled a lot of ink answering the question, why is evangelism necessary if Calvinism is true? So even if you do believe Calvinism is right, even if you do believe that evangelism is still something we should do, though Calvinism is true, you cannot deny the fact of the matter that many people, when first introduced to Calvinism, are faced with that question, logical question of the necessity of evangelism if Calvinism is true. That's just a common objection. And the common objection is this: if God has unchangeably determined who will and won't be saved, then what does it matter if I personally am involved in evangelism or not? Why does it matter? It's a question. Below is a clip from an article written by a respectable Calvinist attempting to answer this all too common objection. So what am I doing, Zach? What am I doing? I'm allowing a Calvinist scholar to represent himself, okay? I'm allowing him to speak for himself. I'm quoting directly from him, right? Which is what people should do for us as well, right? Okay, here's the quote. Some would see the Calvinist as holding to what is sometimes called theistic fatalism, okay? So instead of naturalistic fatalism, like the unbelievers might hold to, this is called theistic fatalism. Obviously, much different than pure fate type of fatalism. This view would acknowledge God as the cause of all things, which is certainly true. So notice this guy is a theistic determinist. He does believe God is the cause of all things. So he says, which is certainly true, but would then lead to a false conclusion of inactivity. And this really is ultimately what separates a theological Calvinist from a theistic fatalist. The conclusion we draw based upon God's sovereignty and God's ordination, fatalism leads to inactivity, while Calvinism leads to the opposite. Notice it's again, just like Colin pointed out. This guy's pointing out the same thing, right? Fatalism believes the same thing as Calvinism, but the fatalist becomes inactive and the Calvinist becomes active, right? But of course, what determines for a Calvinist to become fatalistically inactive and the other Calvinist to become actively involved in evangelism? God's decree, God's determination. So God is ultimately determining whether you become a fatalist or not, right? Continuing with the quote, the Calvinist belief in God's sovereign power does not lead to inactivity. Well, unless it does. It says does not lead to inactivity unless God determines it to. And it determines for your belief in his sovereign, quote unquote, determinism to lead to inactivity. If God determines for a person to become that way, then he will, right? But rather activity on a grand scale. And part of the reason for this is that a Calvinist believes God not only ordains the ends, but also the means. How many times have you heard that? Okay. This is often heard from Calvinists. If you start throwing the accusation of determinism with regard to fatalistic concepts and ideas, or ask this question, why evangelize? This is often the answer. God ordains the ends as well as the means. In other words, he ordains not only the saving of the elect person, but he ordains the means by which that elect person is saved, which is interesting, by the way, when someone's saved through the message of someone like Charles Finney or Beth Moore, shock and awe, or someone like that oftentimes are being spoken out against by the Calvinist world. God ordained the very means that you're speaking out against. And that's always an interesting thing. So God ordained the ends as well as the means. So that evangelistic sermon that you think was manipulative from a Charles Finney, or that you think was unbiblical because it was from a woman like Beth Moore, all of a sudden you have God ordaining the means to the end of that particular Christian becoming evangelized and becoming saved. And now you're bemoaning the very means you think God ordained for the salvation of some of his elect. Go figure. Nevertheless, fatalism, however, is largely unconcerned with the means, holding to more of a let us eat and drink and be merry for tomorrow we die sort of philosophy. This is much different from the result of Calvinistic philosophy of God's ordaining work. The Calvinist teaches that while God ordains the end of salvation for his elect, he also ordains the means of their salvation through belief in the gospel. Pure biblical Calvinism would lead to a vibrant form of evangelism. Well, except when it doesn't. Okay. Like with the Westboro Baptist guys, they hold to Calvinism. They hold to the tenets of theistic determinism, right? But they're not evangelistic. They're hyper. Why? because God determined them to be on Calvinism, even on basic theistic determinism. They were determined to be that way, according to the claims of your worldview. As he goes on, as I think you'll clearly see displayed in the New Testament by the apostles, so the end and the means are both ordained by God. And this is Shane Katzler's, which is our link there that you can go look at the entire article. Okay, so that's the article that represents, I think, what you'll see from most leading Calvinists with regard to this argument. Why evangelize? Why should we be evangelistic? Is it all just faded anyway? And there's a good representation of an answer from a Calvinist right there. Okay, so I go on to write this. It's interesting to me that when a Calvinist seeks to defend against the charge of being a theistic fatalist, he often argues God not only ordains the end, but also the means, as if that is a point the theistic fatalist would also in any way deny. In other words, our fatalists are not denying that God determines ends and their means. God determines everything on both views, okay? That argument does not void the charge of theistic fatalism, but in fact affirms it. For what is theistic fatalism if not God's determination of not only the ends, but every single desire, thought, and action, the means that bring about those ends? That's the point I'm making. The reason the guy in the boat doesn't want to throw the rope out there, because his desire and his thoughts and his actions are determined to not to want to throw the rope out there. Why? Because he believes all things are determined. Even his desire not to throw the rope. Are you following at least? Okay, keep on going. What do the Calvinists think this qualification is accomplishing in their effort to distinguish themselves from the theistic fatalist? The belief that God unchangeably causes every meticulous detail of both the ends and their given means is at the very heart of theistic fatalism. Are there theistic fatalists out there arguing God doesn't determine the means, while the Calvinists are going around correcting them, saying, no, God does control the means too? Of course not. Both systems of thought clearly affirm God's cause of all things, including the ends and their respective means. So in other words, both of them believe in EDD, exhaustive divine determinism. The theistic determinist believes it, the fatalist believes it. They both believe the same doctrines, okay? So what is the author seeking to accomplish by pointing out a common belief that both Calvinist and theistic fatalist share? It appears to me the only real difference between a theistic fatalist and a compatibilistic Calvinist is the latter refuses to accept the practical implications of their own claims in order to remain consistent with the clear teaching of the Bible. In both theistic fatalism and in Calvinism, if God sovereignly decrees for me to go witness to my neighbor, he will give me the effectual desire to go witness to my neighbor, i.e., if he wants me to throw the rope to the drowning person in the water, then he will cause me to desire and decree for me to throw the rope. And if I don't throw the rope, it must be because he has decreed for me not to have the desire to throw the rope, right? Exactly. If my neighbor is one of his elect, and God has unchangeably elected for me to be the means by which my neighbor comes to Christ, then logically, I would have to believe that God will give me the effectual desire and the opportunity to carry out his preordained plan, i.e., God ordained the means. If that effectual desire never comes, then why couldn't I rightly conclude it ultimately was not God's preordained plan for me to be the means through which my neighbor would come to Christ? Thus, what is somebody doing? They're giving over their responsibility to say, I'm not really responsible for going and witnessing to my neighbor. God is responsible for giving me the opportunity and the desire to do so. Therefore, when I don't do so, God's the one who decreed for me not to do so. It wasn't my neglect. It wasn't my free decision, my responsibility to respond to his command. It was God, ultimately, who made this decision. The only logical argument a compatibilistic Calvinist could bring to this charge is, well, that's true, but you can't think that way. And if y'all remember, back when I first wrote this article, I did a broadcast on this, and I actually played a clip from John Piper in a prison. He was giving answers to questions people were asking. I think it was in a prison that he was asking. And he says, sometimes you have to be more biblical than Calvinistic. That got a lot of play, if you can remember. And that's his whole point. That's exactly what he's getting to. Yeah, this is true. Determinism is true, but you can't think like that. Because if you think that way, then you're not going to be consistent. You're not gonna live out the way you should be living, right? So the best that a compatibilistic Calvinist can ultimately say, well, it's true, but you can't think that way. In other words, the compatibilist has to ignore the truth claims of his own systematic in order to live practically, to have a tenable life. He has to believe that his decisions really do matter. that he is really responsible and that God's not the one who's ultimately responsible for his behavior and decisions. His actual beliefs are untenable and must be ignored in order to remain consistent with the biblical mandate to go and throw ropes, share the gospel. If you go back and reread the Calvinistic explanation posted above, you will notice that there's no difference in the actual claims of the Calvinist and the theistic fatalist. The only difference is how the person chooses to act in response to that commonly held belief of divine determinism. And therein lies the problem for the Calvinist. For that choice is just as unchangeably determined by God as is the choice of his elect to believe. Did you follow that? Under the Calvinistic system, God unchangeably determines those who will accept that belief, that God not only ordains the ends, but also the means, and he determines if that believer will respond with evangelistic activity or inactivity. In other words, God decides if the believer of theistic determinism will become a hyper-Calvinist who refuses to actively participate in evangelism, or a productive, obedient Calvinist like the author above. Calvinists are known to argue, quote, God has ordained for his elect to be saved through the proclamation of the gospel, end quote. But wouldn't they likewise argue that God has ordained for the saved to proclaim the gospel when they do proclaim it, and not to proclaim it when they remain disobediently inactive? After all, the author does affirm that God causes all things that come to pass, which would include the inactivity of the saints, would it not? Think about this. If any particular Calvinist chooses to disobey God and not proclaim the gospel when impressed to do so by the Holy Spirit, who is really responsible for that choice to disobey? See, this is why I say over and over and over again, in Calvinist well-intended effort to give God all the praise for good behavior, they've ultimately made God the blame for all bad behavior. Why? Because they impose theistic determinism, i.e. effectuality, into the scriptures when it's not due. So when they hear God granted or God enabled or God drew people to himself or God did this, they read effectuality. They assume that in order for God to get all the credit for the gifts that he gives, he has to effectually give them. Because if he gives a gift and it's not effectually given, then somehow man can steal some of the glory, as if giving a gift is not glory in and of itself. Since when does a gift have to be effectually given in order for the giver to get full credit for giving it? It's untrue in any other walk of life. There's no walk of life in which we think that somebody's provision has to be effectually applied in order for them to get all the credit for that provision. The reason that we're to blame for our lack of belief or our lack of truth or our lack of following God is because we neglect his provision, not because he's neglected to provide it. Which is worse, the person who's rejecting a God who doesn't ever provide for them, a God who doesn't really love them, a God who's actually reprobated them, doomed from the womb, destined for wrath for the praise of his own glory, the person who walks away from that God, or the person who walks away from a God who loves and provides everything they need for salvation? Which one is really more blameworthy? Which one is really worse? Which one is really more deserving of hell? Be objective, Calvinist. The people who reject God's provision are far worse than the ones who are walking away from a God who's never provided for them. And you have to objectively understand that in order to understand our objection against what you're claiming to be true. Has God, for some unknown reason, not granted the sufficient grace to convince the wills of his messengers to proclaim the truth when told to do so? Or has the messenger disobeyed of his own libertarianly free will? And what is the result of that disobedience? When an individual Calvinistic believer disobeys God's command to evangelize, did any fewer elect individuals respond in faith than what God has ordained? Of course not. Why? Because God ordained for that Calvinist disobedience at the same level of sovereign control as he ordaining for any other Calvinist obedience. Are you following the logic here? When a Calvinist is obedient, it's because God decreed for him to be obedient. When a Calvinist is disobedient, it's because God decreed for him to be disobedient. And that's where the fatalism ultimately stands, is that the reason you become a fatalist is because God determined you to become a fatalist if you are one. You see, a Calvinist may argue that evangelism in general is necessary for the salvation of the elect in general. But logically, your individual responsibility to evangelize any particular elect person is not necessary for the salvation of that elect person. After all, if you weren't ordained to evangelize that elect individual, someone else was. Otherwise, they wouldn't be elect, right? Granted, someone, but not necessarily you, has to share the gospel with the elect in order for them to be saved. If God has ordained you to be that evangelist, then he will give you the effectual desire to do so. Thus, if you refrain from doing so, you could rightly conclude that you weren't meant to be the means for that person's salvation. You are left with the perfect excuse for your inactivity and your disobedience to God's command. Quote, God unchangeably ordained the means, or in this case, my lack of participation in those means, end quote. So the next time a Calvinist argues that God ordains the ends as well as the means, just remember this does not avoid the charge of theistic fatalism, but it actually confirms it. In fact, their system logically affirms that the believer's inactive disobedience is as much according to God's ordained plan as is another believer's active obedience. So if and when Calvinist becomes hyper or anti-evangelistic in his behavior, he does so by divine decree. And so too, if a Calvinist becomes highly evangelistic in his behavior, he does so equally by God's sovereign, unchangeable decree, i.e. God ordains the means. A consistent Calvinistic scholar cannot get around this logical fact, no matter how much theological rhetoric they use to placate their opponents. The best they can do is say, just don't think of it that way, which in essence means act like what we believe isn't true. And to that I say, amen. Act like what they believe isn't true. That's the best way to go about this. It's like I've argued before. If determinism is true and God wants you to be a determinist, he'll determine you to be one. If, however, determinism isn't true, then shouldn't you choose not to be a determinist? And don't you have the freedom to do so? That's the safest place for you to be. If you're going to make a bet here, this is kind of like the Pascal's wager thing, right? If you're going to make a bet here, make a bet on indeterminism. Because if God's a determinist and wants you to be a determinist, then he'll determine you to be one. So you might as well freely choose not to be one until he determines you to be one. Safe place to be. Thank you for the super chat, Kevin. Appreciate that. He says, never met a Calvinist who lived as if determinism was true. Fantastic work. Keep it up. Thank you, Kevin, for your super chat and for your kind words. I'm just pushing on this point. Why? Because I want people to recognize what I think William Lane Craig points out and many others point out, is that theistic determinism, whether it applies fatalistically or not, consistently all the time, whether that happens or not, is an untenable, impersonal, unworkable way of life. And I think truth is practical. I think applied theology means we are to be able to apply what we actually believe in real life. This is one of the reasons that I think even Al Mohler and others pointed out among the naturalistic fatalists that they did this study. Remember the study that I reported on years ago, that the naturalistic determinists actually have come to the conclusion that the belief in naturalistic determinism is not good for the well-being of society. That's the conclusions they came to. They say, in other words, we believe naturalistic determinism is true, but it's not good because the studies show that people who believe in naturalistic determinism are more likely to steal, kill, and hurt others because they act fatalistically. It doesn't matter. It's all nonsense anyway. It's just all causally determined by things outside my control. I don't have any control of it. So people who believe in naturalistic determinism tend to be bad citizens, is what the study ultimately came out to show. And so the determinists, the leading scholar determinists, they came out with this conclusion. Though we do believe naturalistic determinism is true, because logically it entails it must be true on their philosophy, we don't believe it is proper to teach it within society because it does not lead to good behavior from citizens. Therefore, we should believe it, but we shouldn't teach it. We should believe it, but it's not practical for good citizenship and life. So we shouldn't let people know about this. Keep it under the wraps. Same with theistic determinism, in my estimation. It's not a practical, tenable way of living life. And so we should do better. Actually believe what is real, believe what is practical, believe what is true. Believe in a God who provides. God bless. See y'all next time. Bye-bye.